Hi, I'm Terry and I'm conservative for a reason. One of the most important topics of the day today is the Electoral College. It's going to become much more important as we draw closer to the next election cycle. This could cause an actual constitutional crisis. Do you understand it? Can you have an intelligent conversation?
When in the course of human events,
we, the people of the United States,
all
men are created perfect
equal.
union, establish justice,
Not my president.
I say that the Electoral College could cause an actual constitutional crisis. See, every time our president today itches his eyebrow, rubs his nose, or uses an executive authority, somebody's yelling, "Oh my God, we're having a constitutional crisis." No, we're not. We're having a constitutional crisis when the very foundation of our republic is threatened. And that could happen very easily in the next election cycle. This is a very simple topic, but it's huge. It's so big, this is going to be a series of presentations. And in the series, we're going to answer what is the Electoral College, how and why it works, why it's unusual, and I'm actually going to tie it to one of the hard topics of the day that the social justice warriors like to harp on a lot, and tie it to the topic of bullying. And yes, it relates to bullying, and I'll explain that in a future presentation. We're also going to talk about whether the Electoral College can be defeated or circumvented and how that could happen, and there's where the true constitutional crisis could occur. That'll happen in a future presentation, and then by the time it's all over, I'm going to analyze the 2016 election cycle from an Electoral College perspective, and that's what made this such a hot topic and why it'll continue to be such a hot topic, because as we all know, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by a couple of million votes, yet Donald Trump won a resounding electoral victory. How did that happen? Why did it happen? Is it right for that to happen? So today, all I'm going to do is Basic Civics 101. How do we elect a president? What is the Electoral College? I'm not going to defend, criticize, editorialize in this presentation. All I want to do today is level set our understanding of what the Electoral College really is. And to start with that, I'm going to start a little bit off topic and remind you, if you've followed any of my previous videos, of the 10th Amendment, the last amendment in the Bill of Rights, when the Founding Fathers had enumerated all of the rights that they promised to safeguard to us as citizens. They then followed it up with the 10th Amendment, which says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. That's very important, and it relates directly to the Electoral College, and I'll tell you how. The founders wanted to conceptualize a small, limited federal government. The 10th Amendment is meant to force that federal government to be self-limiting. Whatever authority it isn't specifically granted, it can't take. It has to go back to the states or to the people. Now, I know that in this day and age that concept has gone away, and the federal government has grown way, way, way out of proportion of what the Founding Fathers intended, and I'm sure they would not be happy about it, but that's another topic for another day. Today, I want to relate this all to the Electoral College. Now, we're going to lay a little bit of constitutional basis, and you can do the detailed reading if you want to. It's not a lot. It's in Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. If you remember basic civics, Article 1 talks about the legislature, how it's formed, what its responsibilities are, etc. Article 2 does the same thing for the executive branch. Article 3 for the judicial branch. Okay? The federal the federal Constitution only talks about electing a president from the electoral and legislative process, okay? And that's what we're going to deal with. The federal Constitution talks about things like how many votes does each state get in the electoral system. That's tied to Congress, and I'll do that in detail in a minute. What are the qualifications of electoral voters? There are only really two qualifications. They cannot be a sitting senator or representative, and they cannot hold any office of trust or profit under the United States. In other words, they can't trade their vote for money in their government position. It can't. It's a fiduciary problem. And the federal Constitution talks about electoral balloting details. The states make all the rest of their own rules, such as the age of the voters, how are the elections held, how do they choose their electors, and whatever. Now, one of the important issues is how many votes per state in the Electoral College, and there's a lot of misunderstanding. I had a conversation with somebody the other day who thought that in the Electoral College they got 1 vote per senator, 2 votes per state, which is so unfair because then California is such a huge state, doesn't have any more votes than a small state like Vermont. And well, basically that's not correct. It's tied to all of the voting members of Congress in each state. So, there are 435 state representatives serving today in Washington and 100 senators. Each state has 2 senators in Washington, and each state has some number of representatives proportional to their population. Now, I'll say this, and you can go down the rabbit hole of figuring out how that's done if you want to, but it's, to me, right now, enough to know that the electoral votes are tied to representation in Washington, and that if the proportion of representatives and senators is correct for passing legislation, it's correct for voting a president. Maybe we can have some discussion about that later. I've got some other thoughts about it. The 435 representatives has been fixed by law since 1911, and that's basically because there's room in the House chamber in D.C. for 435 representatives. That was fixed by law in 1911. There was one exception for a couple of years when Alaska and Hawaii became states. They each got to seat one representative until the next census. So every 10 years we have a census that determines the proportional population of each state, and if it's warranted, the 435 representatives are redistributed. A state may pick up one, a state may lose one, but there are never more than 435 representatives. So what does that mean? 435 plus 100, that's 535 total electoral votes. To elect a president, a candidate has to receive a simple majority of 51%, and that's 270 electoral votes. Okay, so now, with that basis, let's talk about how we elect a president. The first thing is that the states select electors. That's what happens on voting day when you and I go to the ballot and check a box for a candidate. Each candidate has so many potential electors depending on the state that you're in. The candidate that wins that state gets those electors. They become your state's electors, okay? The process for selecting the electors is up to the state. It's not a federal mandate, which means we have popular votes, but if some state were to decide tomorrow that they wanted the legislature to choose their electors, they could can the popular vote, and put it to legislature. There's no requirement for a popular vote. It just happens that it makes sense, so there is a popular vote in all the states. So on voting day, which is the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November, we go into the ballot box. At the end of the day, our state has selected its group of electors based on the number of senators and representatives, plus 3 for Washington, D.C. That the 23rd Amendment gave D.C. the minimal amount of electoral votes, which is 3. Okay? So each party has selected their electors before Electoral Day. In other words, in order to get on a ballot for a third-party candidate to get on the ballot in your state, they have to have the requisite number of electors on tap so that if their candidate wins, the electors are there. The electors are expected to vote in the electoral vote the way that their state election turned out, and they normally do. And the statistic is less than 1% have not done that, and that's called an unfaithful voter. Now, we also need to note that all but 2 states are winner-take-all states, which means that the electors representing the candidate that won the popular vote in that state will vote on electors election day. Too many words that are too close to the same. There are 2 states that are not winner take all, Maine and Nebraska. In Maine and Nebraska, the electors are tied to the legislative districts, so they can actually vote for 2 different candidates in the electoral election in Maine and Nebraska. The two electoral votes that represent the senators go to the popular vote winner, and the representative elector from each congressional district votes according to that district. So I hope that didn't get confusing. If it did, listen to it again. It's pretty simple. So the electors vote as they're supposed to on the Monday after the second Wednesday in December. That's when the electors meet in each state to cast their votes. The votes are tabulated, signed, certified, and sent to the Senate President for counting. That's the process as far as the Electoral College is concerned for how we elect a president. The remainder of Article 2, Section 1 is beyond the scope of this talk. That talks about what the legislature does with those votes, how they count them, how they tabulate them, how they certify them, and what we're concerned with today is the electoral process. Okay, so now we have laid a foundation of how the electoral process actually works so that we can have further conversations. So the next conversation will be about why it works, and we're going to start talking a little bit about the difference between the electoral vote and the popular vote, and why the electoral vote is probably the way to go and why the popular vote is not the way to go, why the Electoral College is the way to vote in a republic, why the popular vote is the way to vote in a democracy, and why we are not a democracy, we are a republic, and the reasons for that. So buckle up your seatbelts for the next conversation, and I'll see you next time. In the meantime, find me on Facebook, send me an invite if we're not friends on Facebook yet. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, frog through there. There's some good information. You might enjoy yourself. Have a nice day.